Hello and welcome to today's webinar, Who's Ready for the Next One? I am Sean Buckles, Head Statistical Officer and Director of Housing and Demographic Analysis at the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, also known as HUD, and I'm your host for today's presentation. Today we will look at the American Housing Survey's 2017 data on emergency and disaster preparedness and delve into the important story it tells about household preparedness in America, and especially in some of the nation's most disaster-prone areas. We'll start by listening to a brief introduction to the American Housing Survey. There's also a quick review of the questions asked and some data points. After that special presentation, I will be back to talk about some of the stories behind the 2017 American Housing Survey Emergency and Disaster Preparedness module data. We will take a look at specific questions in the module and talk about why the question was included and what the data showed. Christy Collins from the Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA, will join me to share her thoughts about the data and what it means for FEMA. And finally, we will take your questions. As we play this special presentation for you and during our discussion, feel free to post your questions in the chat box. We will answer as many as we can at the end. Now, please listen to this special presentation and I will be back shortly.
What is the American Housing Survey? The American Housing Survey is the nation's most comprehensive housing survey. The Department of Housing and Urban Development, or HUD, funds and provides oversight for the survey. The U.S. Census Bureau, or Census, collects the data. The American Housing Survey has provided current and continuous data on the U.S. housing stock and the people who occupy America's households since 1973. These days, the American Housing Survey is conducted every 2 years. We recently finished the 2019 data collection period, and we are looking forward to conducting the next American Housing Survey in 2021. HUD uses American Housing Survey data to examine issues that are critical to advancing our mission, improving our effectiveness, and designing housing programs that meet the needs of different target groups, including first-time homebuyers and older Americans. Policy analysts, program managers, and budget analysts in federal, state, and local governments use American Housing Survey data to monitor housing supply and demand, as well as changes in housing conditions and costs. Private organizations, including trade associations, use American Housing Survey data to study issues important to our member communities. Finally, academic researchers at our nation's universities and think tanks use the American Housing Survey data to gain a deeper understanding of housing policy issues, including housing affordability for low-income renters. The American Housing Survey provides current information on a wide range of core housing topics. Core housing topics are included in every survey and include the size and composition of the nation's housing inventory, vacancies, heating and cooking fuel usage, the physical condition of housing units, characteristics of occupants, equipment breakdowns, home improvements, mortgages and other housing costs, persons living in or eligible for assisted housing, home values, and characteristics of recent movers. In addition to the core topics, the American Housing Survey includes a series of rotating topical modules that collect data on a wide variety of housing-related topics of special interest to HUD and the American Housing Survey user community. These rotating modules provide unique insights on topics like health and safety hazards in the home, food insecurity, the use of housing counseling services, the presence of arts and cultural opportunities in the community, neighborhood characteristics, delinquent rent or mortgage payments, and emergency and disaster preparedness, among others. The American Housing Survey is a nationwide survey that is designed to produce national estimates for 25 large metropolitan areas, and estimates for certain states. You can find more information on the American Housing Survey, including several tutorial videos and documents on how to use tools like the American Housing Survey Table Creator and Codebook online at census.gov/programs-surveys/AHS. And now for today's topic. Why is HUD interested in emergency and disaster preparedness? Monitoring the housing stock's susceptibility to disasters and residents' readiness for these emergencies is important to HUD, especially since America's low and moderate income communities are often the hardest hit by these events. In 2013, HUD launched a new American Housing Survey topical module developed in collaboration with FEMA to collect data on how prepared households across the country are for all kinds of disasters, from floods and earthquakes to tornadoes and other catastrophic events. HUD elected to collect data again in 2017, allowing policy analysts, researchers, and others to track changes in disaster preparedness over time and identify relationships between disaster preparedness and how and where people live. Much of the module's content is based on FEMA guidelines for disaster preparedness and other disaster preparedness surveys. However, no other survey has attempted to measure national household disaster preparedness with a sample size as large as that of the American Housing Survey. And no other disaster preparedness survey permits cross-tabulations by the socioeconomic groups of special interest to HUD. The 2017 American Housing Survey Emergency and Disaster Preparedness module included a wide range of questions about household preparedness. For example, we asked householders whether they have emergency supplies, such as a generator and adequate food and water, and whether they have a communication plan and an agreed-upon meeting point. We wanted to know if households have access to vital financial information and whether assistance is needed to evacuate or shelter a pet, and if households have vehicles available to evacuate all members. We also asked where households' members would likely stay during a 2-week evacuation, where they would turn for emergency information, if the home has a tornado safe room or shelter, and if the household is covered by flood insurance. For rental units specifically, we asked renters about any disaster repairs that had been made to their units in the last 2 years. Where are households most prepared? Let's take a look at the survey's results. As noted earlier, the American Housing Survey is a nationwide survey that is designed to produce national estimates for 25 large metropolitan areas, and estimates for certain states. Users can split up the national data across multiple variables to examine and compare how households with certain demographic and housing characteristics responded to questions. Let's begin by going through some of the national level results. The American Housing Survey data reveals differences in preparedness between renters and homeowners. The 2017 survey data shows that renters are 3 times more likely than homeowners to need financial assistance to evacuate during a major disaster. Approximately 39% of American Housing Survey renter respondents said that they would not be able to pay for evacuation expenses in a disaster, an estimated cost of up to $2,000. In contrast, 88% of homeowner households would have access to funds of up to $2,000 in an emergency. The American Housing Survey data reveals some differences in how households of different racial backgrounds may respond to or be impacted by disaster. The 2017 survey shows that Black households are 2 times more likely than white households to seek public shelter as their likely place to stay during a 2-week evacuation. Approximately 8% of Black American Housing Survey respondents indicated that they would seek public shelter. In contrast, 4% of white households would seek public shelter. The findings show that age is another factor that could influence disaster preparedness and immediate response.
The 2017 survey data shows that respondents 25 to 29 years old are twice as likely as respondents 55 to 64 years old to use the internet to receive emergency information during a national disaster. Approximately 51% of American Housing Survey respondents 25 to 29 years old list the internet as their first source of emergency information during a national disaster.
In contrast, only 26% of respondents ages 55 to 64 list the internet as their first source, with most of these respondents preferring television. Now, let's take a closer look at a few of the states that typically experience a large number of emergencies and disasters. Texas is one of the states that has experienced the greatest number of natural disasters in recent history. Since 1953, Texas has had 255 major disaster declarations. That's an average of more than 3 natural disasters per year. Texas has been hit with tornadoes, floods, wildfires, and regular coastal hurricanes. One of the deadliest and costliest storms in recent decades was Hurricane Alicia, which blasted onto Galveston Beach with 115-mile-per-hour winds and a 10-foot storm surge, leaving 21 people dead and causing nearly $6 billion in damage. More recently, Hurricane Harvey came ashore in August 2017. The Category 4 storm caused historic flooding. Hurricane Harvey set a record for the most rainfall from a tropical cyclone in the continental United States, with 51 inches of rain recorded in some areas of Texas. An estimated 27 trillion gallons of water fell over Texas and Louisiana during a 6-day period. Despite the high likelihood of a disaster in the state, less than 1/2 of Texas households responded yes when asked key questions on natural disaster and emergency preparedness. For example, only 15% of households living in single and multi-unit buildings have a generator present. That's lower than the national average of 19% and less than Florida, which reports 22% of households with generators. Another eye-opening statistic: only 6% of Texas households living in single-family homes without basements or in multi-unit structures with 3 or fewer floors report that their home has a tornado-safe room or shelter. That's also lower than the national average of 11%. The Sunshine State has had 150 major disaster declarations since 1953, an average of more than 2 natural disasters per year. Florida has been pummeled by dozens of tropical storm systems, none worse than Hurricane Andrew in 1992. This Category 5 hurricane, with gusts of more than 200 miles per hour, held the title as the most expensive natural disaster in U.S. history until Hurricane Katrina in 2005. In 2017, Hurricane Irma hit southwest Florida, battering the state's lower half and leaving a trail of tornadoes and storm surge flooding as its core slowly moved inland. And since most of the state is at or near sea level, Florida is prone to heavy flooding. Despite being extremely susceptible to floods, only 25% of Florida households in owner-occupied housing units report having flood insurance. That number is slightly higher than in flood-prone Texas, which reports 20% of households with flood insurance. Both Florida and Texas are above the national average of 11%. Some good news: having an emergency evacuation kit appears to be a priority for Florida households, with 70% reporting having an emergency evacuation kit. That's significantly higher than the national average of 54%. California is the nation's most populous state. It also is one of the most disaster-prone, with 314 major disaster declarations since 1953, more than 4 per year. California is threatened by wildfires, landslides, flooding, winter storms, severe freezes, and even tsunami waves. But the disaster most often associated with the Golden State is earthquakes, and for good reason. The worst California earthquakes in recent years have included a magnitude 6.9 earthquake near San Francisco in 1989 that killed 63 people, and a magnitude 6.7 earthquake in Southern California in 1994 that killed 61 people. While earthquakes remain a serious threat in California, in recent years, wildfires have been the most damaging type of disaster across the state. The California Department of Forestry and Fire Protection and the U.S. Forest Service reported that, as of December 22, 2019, over 7,860 fires have been recorded in the state. Nearly 260,000 acres of land were burned. According to CAL FIRE, in the last 2 years, 105 people died in California wildfires. These kinds of natural disasters quickly become emergencies in California. To locate and reconnect quickly with household members, a communication plan is a family necessity. Across the state, 30% of households with 2 or more persons have a communication plan if cell service is disrupted. 38% of households have an agreed-upon meeting location. And 94% of households have emergency vehicles available. These numbers are on par with national averages. Now, let's take a look at a few metro areas included in the 2017 American Housing Survey and see how they compare on specific disaster-related questions. For this comparison, we've selected the Los Angeles, Houston, Miami, and Minneapolis-St. Paul metropolitan areas. Each of these metro areas experiences extreme weather and natural disasters at higher than average rates. In fact, the Minneapolis metropolitan area is especially significant, since Minnesota ranks number 1 for having the most extreme winter weather in the country. First, let's compare homes that have generators. These include 1-unit buildings and multi-unit buildings with 2 to 4 units. The Los Angeles metropolitan area has the lowest percentage of homes with generators at 8%, while the Miami metropolitan area has the highest at 27%. The national average is 19%. Next, let's look at whether households have enough non-perishable food for at least 3 days. The national average of homes that replied no is 17%. All metropolitan areas were below the national average, aside from the Los Angeles metropolitan area, which had the highest percentage of homes that responded no to this question at 21%. We also asked how many households have at least 3 gallons or 24 bottles of water per person. The Minneapolis metropolitan area comes in significantly lower than the 3 other metropolitan areas highlighted here at 48%, which is also lower than the national average of 60%. When we asked households if they had prepared an emergency evacuation kit, it may come as no surprise that 78% of households in the Miami metropolitan area responded yes, which is significantly higher than the national average of 54%. If we look at the number of homes covered by flood insurance in these metropolitan areas, we see that only 4% of homes in the Minnesota metro have flood insurance, compared to nearly 40% of homes in the Houston and Miami metropolitan areas, where flooding is much more prevalent. Thank you for listening to this brief overview of the American Housing Survey. Now, back to your host, Mr. Sean Buchholz.
Thank you. We hope you enjoyed that special presentation on the American Housing Survey and the 2017 Emergency and Disaster Preparedness data. If you are just joining us, I am Sean Buchholz, Head Statistical Officer and Director of Housing and Demographic Analysis at the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, and I am your host for today's presentation. Now, let's get back to the data and talk about some of the stories behind it. Joining me for this conversation is Christy Collins, Branch Chief of the Federal Emergency Management Agency's Individual and Community Preparedness Division. Welcome, Christy. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thanks, Sean. I'm very excited to be here.
We stated earlier in our presentation that HUD and FEMA worked collaboratively on developing the Emergency and Disaster Preparedness module in the 2017 American Housing Survey. What you may not know is that HUD and FEMA revised the module that was first deployed in the 2013 American Housing Survey. We revised questions on finding disaster information, on flood insurance, and on the availability of emergency supplies. And we added some new questions to identify connections between disasters and reasons for moving. So, Christy, tell us why it is important for FEMA to seize the opportunity to work with HUD on the 2017 American Housing Survey's Emergency and Disaster Preparedness Module.
Sure. So I'm really excited to be here today to share with everyone kind of how we've used this data and also how it's really helped to bolster some of the research and data that FEMA collects independently. So as Sean mentioned, I'm with the FEMA's Individual and Community Preparedness Division. So we really focus on connecting individuals, organizations, and communities at large with research and tools that help them to sustain capabilities to prepare for any disaster or emergency. And I'm the chief of the Preparedness Behavior Change branch. So we really look at different research methods that we can leverage to collect data that really bolsters the number of different preparedness programs and initiatives that we have within ICPD that we manage nationally. So for us, it was really exciting when we had this opportunity to partner because we could understand a little bit more about not only what's interesting to HUD and what's relevant to HUD and helps us to kind of be stronger partners within the federal family, but also the information that HUD collects is a little bit different than some of the information that we collect at FEMA. So between those two, we can actually kind of connect the two pieces together and come up with some really interesting insights that I think Sean and I are going to talk about throughout this afternoon.
So much of the module's content is based on FEMA guidelines for disaster preparedness and other disaster preparedness surveys. Christy, how has the Individual and Community Preparedness Division at FEMA utilized the 2013 and 2017 American Housing Survey data?
Absolutely. So here at FEMA, my office actually conducts what we call the National Household Survey. So just slightly different than the American Housing Survey. Our National Household Survey actually tracks progress in personal disaster preparedness so that we can measure the public's degree of preparedness for hazards that they're likely to face. We look at the public's awareness, attitudes, and experiences that motivate individuals to prepare. And then we use all that information to identify mechanisms of how we can encourage people to actually change their behavior and become more prepared. So our survey is a 5,000-person survey that's representative of a national sample, and then also has 500-person surveys that we call oversamples that are specifically sampled from geographic areas that are at risk for a particular hazard. And we look at 6 different hazards, so tornado, flood, hurricane, wildfire, earthquake, and urban event. So what we found is really interesting is that while our survey really looks at attitudes, behaviors, motivators, and risk perception, the American Housing Survey is really complementary to this because it looks at more detailed demographic information. As Sean mentioned, it's a much larger sample size than ours, which is helpful, I think, because for folks who are in regional offices or state offices or particularly metropolitan areas, this American Housing Survey gives you a little bit of information that you can actually count as specific to those metropolitan areas, which the National Household Survey, ours is a national representation and then a representation of the hazard risk areas. So not necessarily giving specific data for a particular metropolitan area. So we've really found that this, by putting the two together, can help everyone to be able to customize your messages as you're communicating the importance of preparedness to your communities. And that's one of the big things that we at ICPD and FEMA really want to encourage everyone to do. We really want to look at the differences in demographics and then also the differences by hazard type And that helps us to customize the message so that we're not talking to someone in Idaho about the risks of a tsunami. Some of those things seem pretty obvious, and other things actually aren't obvious to us, and that's where the data becomes really important. So in the end, our hope is that by understanding the who with the demographics and the where with the hazard risk, we can create relevant messages for the public that will likely have a greater success rate.
Great, thank you, Christy. So let's talk about some of the data in the 2017 American Housing Survey Emergency and Disaster Preparedness module that we presented earlier. One of the questions we asked households living in single unit and multi-unit buildings with 2 or 4 units is a generator present in the home? Nationally, 19% of the households responded yes. The Miami metropolitan area has the highest percentage of homes with generators at 27%. The Los Angeles metropolitan area has the lowest percentage of homes with generators at 8%. Christy, why are these household responses about generators important to FEMA?
Yeah, so this is one that's actually pretty interesting. So within our office, we actually benchmark preparedness as individuals who take preparedness actions. And we tend to look at 6 basic actions. So this generator question actually represents a higher level of preparedness, and we could almost hypothesize that individuals who've actually gone all the way to the point of preparing enough that they have a generator present means that they've actually been active in preparedness in a number of different areas. So for us, we tend to look at initial actions that might be kind of the gateway to a culture of preparedness for one's lifestyle. So we look at things like, have you attended a meeting or a training? Have you talked with others about preparedness? Have you created an emergency plan? Have you sought information? Have you taken part in a drill, or have you created a supply kit? And I think some of the other questions in the American Housing Survey actually answer some of those data points as well, which is kind of interesting to do some comparison. But the generator, we kind of look at an indicator of highly prepared.
All right, thanks, Christy. So another question included in the 2017 AHS Emergency and Disaster Preparedness module was, is there a tornado safe room or shelter in the home? So let's look at Texas, for instance. The state of Texas has 255 major disaster declarations since 1953, and that's an average of over 3 natural disasters per year. And it includes tornadoes, floods, wildfires, and coastal hurricanes. The 2017 AHS data reveals only 6% of Texas households living in single-family homes without a basement or in multi-unit structures with 3 or fewer floors. Only 6% of homes report that their home has a tornado safe room or shelter. That's nearly 50% lower than the national average of 11%. Christy, given the number of major disaster declarations in the state of Texas, how do you feel about these results concerning the presence of a tornado safe room or shelter in the home?
Yeah, so this one was interesting, and I actually took this data and compared it with the data that we have when we do our tornado oversample. So a little bit of a different population, because the American Housing Survey is really looking at individuals in kind of that urban and suburban metropolitan area, which may or may not be at risk for something like a tornado, whereas the National Household Survey specifically looks at counties that are at higher risk for a tornado. So when we look at that from the National Household Survey perspective, we actually are seeing that within tornado areas, about 69% of individuals state that their emergency plan includes the location of a safe and effective shelter. The other thing that I found interesting, which will help me to kind of compare to the American Housing Survey, was that when we look at individuals within the tornado area, based on the questions that we asked in the FEMA survey, we can see that about 29% of those individuals are looking for ways to prepare within the next year or the next 6 months, which is really exciting because those individuals are people who are an active audience and a captive audience. They're really looking for preparedness information, and sometimes they just don't know how to find it. So when I was thinking through how this information could be relevant, I really started to think about particularly tornadoes. If we think about mobile homes, which getting to that level of detail is not something that the FEMA survey has, but in the American Housing Survey, you can actually rack and stack things based on the housing structure. And I think we all understand that in a mobile home, they are at risk for many, many disasters, whether it's tornadoes, severe weather, hurricanes, and there is absolutely no way to safely shelter within a mobile home. So if we take the mobile home information from the American Housing Survey, and then we compare that with evacuation planning, because we know that everyone who's in a mobile home should always have an evacuation plan, we're actually able to see from the American Housing Survey that around 36% of individuals actually stated that they do not have enough funds to be able to properly evacuate. So that's pretty interesting to me, because on one hand, that says, there's about 60% that, more than half of individuals who live in a mobile home do feel like they have enough funding to properly evacuate. But where the challenge comes in, especially when we're thinking about preparing for response, is how do we assist that remaining 36% that actually doesn't, that knows that they do not have enough funds to be able to evacuate. And that's, of course, in addition to the 5% that weren't able to indicate one way or the other if they had enough funding. Further, if we look at the mobile and manufactured housing information within the American Housing Survey, and we asked individuals if they had a vehicle available to facilitate that evacuation. And I was really pleased to see that 90% of people said yes, which is a good thing. However, that does indicate that about 10% of individuals who live in a mobile or manufactured home actually don't have a vehicle that can facilitate that evacuation, which is really concerning because evacuation needs to happen pretty much immediately, especially for a lot of these tornado and severe weather, which can be no-notice events. So that's something, excuse me, as community leaders, that we really need to be thinking through.
Great. So now let's build off that by looking at households' ability to communicate and connect in the event of emergency or disaster. In the 2017 AHS disaster preparedness module, we asked households, is there a communication plan if cell services is disrupted? And we asked them, do households have an agreed upon meeting location? According to the data, 30% of households have a communication plan if cell service is disrupted, and 37% of households have an agreed upon meeting location. So Christy, why was it important to FEMA to include these questions in the AHS? And do you consider those national results good news or bad news, or how do they fit in with what you see in your own survey?
Yeah, so this is one, we actually look at having an emergency communication plan in place as one of the very first things that we want people to do when they're starting their preparedness journey. Sometimes having a plan can really be the critical piece that helps all of the other preparedness or response efforts that you take fall into place. So looking at this, and we're seeing about 30% having a communication plan if cell service is disrupted. So that makes it a little bit more nuanced. I think this question was asked specifically in that way because the AHS is really talking to individuals who are in more urban areas. And so thinking through the cell service disruption, it can be a big deal and has actually happened several times in New York City, whether it's power outages or terrorism attacks. So looking at that, I have to, as the preparedness SME, remind everyone that just in case you don't know, the right answer is if cell service is down and you want to connect with your loved ones, you guys should all have an agreed to social media site or website where you can communicate with one another. So that way, if you can get to a library or you can get to a place that has internet, then you can communicate that way, even if you're not able to get a phone call through. And it is true that text messages can sometimes go through even when phone calls cannot connect. Red Cross actually has a very good app that allows people to report when they're safe and communicate with their family members. So looking at this and comparing it with the national sample of information that we have from the National Household Survey, we're actually seeing that pretty consistently for the past several years, 48% of individuals have indicated that they have created an emergency plan. And then within those, you have, 83% have a process for connecting with family members, 56% have information on how to evacuate, 80% have information on where to shelter, how to find a safe place, and 21% indicated that public transportation is part of their evacuation plan, which is really something that can be critical when we're trying to evacuate. If this local public transportation is not available, that actually impacts 21% of the population.
All right, thanks, Christy. So I want to move on to talk about flood insurance. In our disaster preparedness module, we asked owner-occupied households, is the home covered by flood insurance? And the data, in the 2017 AHS data reveal that a vast majority of owner-occupied households nationwide don't carry flood insurance. Even in high flood-prone areas like Florida, where only a quarter of the households have flood insurance. Christy, what does this flood insurance data tell FEMA about how prepared households are for flooding?
Yeah, so this is something that's right on par with the information that we've collected as well. We're actually seeing that there is not a higher increase in flood insurance based on geography or based on being in a flood area. So that's definitely not a positive and something that we've been looking at. We've really only seen a slight increase in this over the past few years. So it's generally right around that 25% for both the national sample and for flood areas. Now, what we found to be interesting from our survey, and I think is consistent with what we can see in the AHS, is that individuals in these areas report only about 8% have ever even heard information about how to get flood insurance. So we're definitely seeing a barrier between, we know that people have a need, but we don't know that they understand the need or that they understand how to get insurance. So one of the things that I found that was interesting within the AHS was that we actually asked people information about how, what was their motivation for getting flood insurance. So of the individuals who did get flood insurance, 40% said that it was required for a home purchase or refinance. And only 3% said that they bought it after a neighbor bought it. So we're actually seeing that the home purchase or refinance is one of the biggest motivators, but that still leaves about 57% of the population that really didn't have a specific reason as to why they made that purchase. So it would be interesting to do some more qualitative data to figure out what are those motivators for taking action.
All right, thanks, Christy. So I have two more questions that I want to pose to you, kind of about the overall story that you think the data is telling. So first of all, from an overall perspective, how do you feel how prepared households are for emergencies and disasters, given what the data says?
Yeah, so this one's pretty interesting because I think the NHS and the AHS really work together well to kind of paint a more complete picture. I'm certainly, a little more familiar with the survey that FEMA administers in looking at, the number of preparedness actions that people are taking. I think the real power of the AHS is to give us specific information that we can see in a more detailed fashion based on demographics and housing type, which really gets back to the customization is key. So we know that there's generally four things that influence people to take action, whether it's understanding their risk, being aware of the information or the preparedness actions that they can take, having confidence that if they take the action, it will be effective, and then having experience with a disaster. So those four things really help to motivate people, and having this more detailed information about demographics and housing types really helps us to get to that more customized message. The other thing that I think is probably one of the most powerful and for me the most interesting was the AHS told us a lot about the cost and volume of repairs that individuals have to do because of a particular hazard. So looking at the 2017 data, the combination of tornado and hurricane damage, obviously it is the highest kind of disaster bucket as far as dollar amounts. But the reported number is upwards of $4.5 billion that individuals reported having to make in terms of repairs within the past year. So that means that the average individual who had damage from a tornado or hurricane was spending around $7,000, which I think is an interesting statistic because it helps people then to really think about things more tactically. So if you think, okay, well, I'm at risk of this disaster, but FEMA's going to be there to help you out. Well, that's true to a certain degree, but FEMA only helps so much. And when you start to talk about, do you have $7,000 that might actually help you, and that individuals have reported needing on average, having that more specific information is actually really helpful. So just kind of running through quickly, earthquake, the average cost was $4,500. Fire, the average cost is $10,000. Flood, the average cost was $12,000. You can kind of see that different disasters have different impacts, but they're all pretty severe.
Great, thank you for those thoughts. So along a similar vein, thinking about the overall survey result, are there any geographical areas of the country that concern you, perhaps certain regions of the country, or even drilling down, like differences between urban, suburban, and rural areas?
So I think geographically, trending tends to be the same. If we tend to look at hurricane risk areas, so kind of the southeast, Florida, the Carolinas, those types of things, those people in those areas that are at risk for hurricane tend to be more prepared than other areas, particularly like tornado, flooding. People are definitely not prepared for flooding, which is actually interesting because flooding happens almost everywhere. So that's been one thing that we've been seeing a trend. One of the things that actually I found really interesting is that the AHS asked specific information about pets. And actually pets are a huge, huge motivator for people to actually make change. And so looking at that geographically, there are kind of four areas of the different metropolitan areas that the survey looked at. So those would be Los Angeles, Riverside, Philadelphia, and Miami. Looking at those four areas, actually 30% of people who have pets all reported that they would actually need assistance in caring for their pet if they had to evacuate. So I think that's really interesting because that's a large percentage of people who reported needing that assistance. And then we can compare that with, the Dallas-Fort Worth area, which actually almost had the inverse, where 35% of people specifically said, I do not need assistance. So we're seeing kind of a different trend there in different areas. It would be interesting to look to see if the demographic makeups of those communities are different, or look to see if there are trending with the demographics of individuals who did report needing assistance. Sometimes those can be individuals, seniors who have pets and might need assistance. And so then that actually helps us to do some more customization. Kind of tying back to the mobile home example that I gave earlier, and then crosswalking that with pets, I found it interesting that of those that live in manufactured mobile homes, only 16% reported that they would need help with pets. So that's actually significantly less than what we're seeing in some of these other areas. So I don't know if there's a relationship there between them, being more prepared for evacuation, and so they've already got a plan, or what's causing those trends. But those are all things that we could kind of look into a little bit more. I think it would also be interesting to look at flood insurance trends, crosswalking that with the neighborhood characteristics. For example, the AHS reports out on if your home is, what's the distance to the closest body of water. So if we look at individuals who do or do not have flood insurance that are on waterfront properties or have water within their neighborhood, those individuals are likely in floodplain areas. And so does that awareness and that visibility of seeing the water trigger any sort of increase in flood insurance purposes or trending? Also looking at things like temporary residences or vacation properties, and understanding, is the preparedness reported for individuals reporting for those types of structures, is that different than people who are in, their permanent home? A lot of times people don't think to prepare when they're going on vacation. So making sure that you have emergency supplies, or kind of going back to that first generator question, understanding how you evacuate, making sure that people are planning for all of those types of things, even when they might not be at their primary residence. And I think that's really something that makes the AHS powerful, is that we can start to understand and build a picture of individuals in different circumstances.
All right, thank you, Christy. Those are wonderful responses. And I want to move on to the last part of this webinar, which is to take some questions from the audience. I want to remind you that if you do have questions, to please post those in the chat box, and we will try to get to them. So we had a handful of questions about whether or not HUD plans to include the Emergency and Disaster Preparedness module in any of our upcoming surveys. So I want to first say that we did not put the Emergency and Disaster Preparedness module in the 2019 AHS, which was the most recent survey that we fielded, and we're not intending to put it into the 2021 AHS. Most of our topical modules we put on either a 4 or a 6 year rotating basis, depending upon both our own needs and the needs of the user community. So the next time that we might see the Emergency and Disaster Preparedness module again is most likely in the 2023 American Housing Survey. We also got a question about what topical modules we included in the 2019 AHS. So let me point out that the 2019 American Housing Survey data will, in all likelihood, will come out either late summer or early fall. And for topical modules, we included one topical module on food insecurity. We included a topical module on post-secondary education for household members. And then we included a third rotating topical module on extended disability questions and home accessibility questions. And a couple of additional questions targeted to the Houston metropolitan area concerning experiences coming out of Hurricane Harvey. We also got a couple of questions about how can users get help accessing the Emergency and Disaster Preparedness module data. And I will say that the best way to access that data is through the American Housing Survey Table Creator. That is a web-based summary table mechanism that you can use to look at emergency and disaster preparedness data and to disaggregate the data by household characteristics or housing unit characteristics or characteristics about the occupants of the household and as well as geography. We have posted on the AHS website, on the Census Bureau's AHS website, a tutorial video on how to use the table creator in case you're having any issues with it. But I just want to generally say that recommend accessing the data first through the AHS table creator. I'll add to that for those of you who are prefer to use microdata, the responses to the emergency and disaster preparedness module are in the AHS microdata. So you can download the AHS microdata on the Census Bureau's website, and the AHS codebook will explain, will show you which variables represent the questions that we asked in the module. And we also have a webinar about how to use our web-based AHS codebook and how to access the AHS microdata. So I'd like to wrap up the webinar with one last question. I'm going to throw this one at Christy to answer. So given all the data that you've seen in the AHS disaster preparedness module and thinking towards the future, would you have any recommendations to HUD about additional questions that we might want to include in a future iteration of this module?
Yeah, I certainly think that there could be value in looking at, particularly because the HUD survey is so specific to metropolitan areas, you know, maybe not making the connection to hazard risk, but more understanding the different preparedness trends of individuals in urban areas. I think that could be really interesting. There's also some questions in there about financial preparedness, and financial preparedness is a priority for FEMA currently, and so I would love to see us kind of build out some additional information there as well.
Great, thank you, Christy. I just want to close with a personal note that I really appreciate Christy and her staff at FEMA. They've been wonderful to work with in putting this module together. And it's really great to see that that FEMA is using the data, and really nice to know that that this data has utility for both federal agencies as well as the user community. So on behalf of HUD, FEMA, and the Census Bureau, thank you for joining us for today's presentation on the American Housing Survey's Emergency and Disaster Preparedness Topical Module. We hope this information has given you some ideas about how you can use the survey data to examine household emergency and disaster preparedness across the country. This is just one of the ways we're working to make the American Housing Survey data easy as possible for you to use in your work. Thank you again for joining us.